And welcome to another episode of Sharing with Shellshock. I am your host, ShellshockPrime, and this week we are back with yet another episode. This week we are going to be doing Sega Saturn Stories, and joining me is a returning guest, just one today, and we got Soan. Good to see you back again, Soan.
How's it going?
It's going good.
Hello.
It's good to have you back on.
Third time, actually.
Yep. I'm looking forward to talking about the Sega Saturn today, but before we do, I want to bring up that originally we were supposed to have an episode happen on Sunday, and it was going to be about gaming magazine memories. That episode is getting delayed to like October 6th. That will be happening. We will be although we'll be doing that at a later date, for the simple fact that two of our guests had to cancel at the last minute. So unfortunately, we weren't able to do that. However, we got this episode happening. So Sega Saturn Stories is going to be happening today. And Soan, thank you again for being a part of this. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate the invite, actually.
Yep. So before we get started, remind everybody, what type of content do you do?
I stream on Mondays and Fridays. Monday, I'm finishing up my Sega Genesis marathon. I don't know what I'm going to do after it, but it's in the planning stage. It's up in the air right now. Friday, I don't really have a... Oh, my bad. Monday is going to Friday because I'm doing Ocarina of Time randomizer with a bunch of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I got that mixed up. But usually Sega Genesis was on Mondays, but now it's on Fridays, and that's finishing up then.
Yep. So yeah, because I know you've been doing the Sega Genesis marathon for the past couple of years now, and the fact that it's almost done already, that's actually wild.
Yeah, 3 to 4 years actually.
Yeah, I know. Like since you got back into streaming, and then you've been doing
Yep.
that ever since. So so for the Sega Saturn, the Sega Saturn is a fifth generation console that released by Sega on November 22nd, 1994 in Japan, and released in May 22nd, 1995 in North America, with a European release later in that year. It was revealed during Sega's E3 1995 presentation that Sega announced that the console was going to be released immediately, like during the festivities of E3, much to the shock of everybody, to those who were reporting at E3, the consumers, the retailers, and all the third-party developers and publishers who pledged their support with the system. They were all caught off guard to the point where many retailers who didn't get any Sega Saturn units at the time, they felt betrayed to the point where they chose not to carry any Sega products moving forward, and a lot of companies had to rush and scramble to get their games out as soon as possible because they were developing ready to get their games ready for launch. But unfortunately, Sega was like, no. And it got to the point where the console would end up not performing well at all. It actually, outside of Japan, it actually was a bomb. It sold over 9.26 million units worldwide throughout its lifespan, which for a home console, it's actually very low in comparison to many other consoles that came before and after it. And um, and because of that, it actually put Sega in such a hole in which that there was like a good year and a half of no Sega products until the release of the Sega Dreamcast. But basically that's the story of the Sega Saturn in a nutshell. There's a lot more that we'll definitely be talking about later in the podcast, but but yeah, like that's basically just the long story short of the Sega Saturn, and and how it started and the fate of it. So let's start with the first topic for Sega Saturn. How did you first find out about the Sega Saturn, and when did you get one, Son?
Well, it's going to be a two-parter here. So the first time I saw it was in the Toys R Us.
Mm-hmm.
I was walking down the lane checking out it, and I just saw a wall of coming soon. And I checked out the game. Was like, what is this? I don't get it. Then along another wall showed a bunch of other consoles that Sega had made, like Nomad, um, 32X, and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, this is not going to be great. It just doesn't look all that good.
Mm-hmm.
But I do remember the commercials being like in your face, and I'm like, yeah, we'll see what's gonna go happen. So about a year later, or within a year probably, I saw it at not a KB, a Funkoland. I
Yeah.
think Funkoland was still around.
Yeah, Funko was
Um,
around that time, yeah.
yes, so they had demos of it. They had what's that one game, the flying game, Panzer Dragoon,
The Patrick
and I
Dragoon.
tried it out, and but the price was still like 4.99, but they were like at the time, like the price was going to go down for like the so one of the people said, "Oh, the rumor has it's going to get cheaper." I'm like, "Okay, I'll think about it." And then I went to like Blockbuster and I saw some rentals of games that I wanted to try out. Then I decided to buy it. I don't remember what games I picked up. Um, let's see here. I'm looking at the list of games that I played. I think Sonic Jam was one of them.
Yeah.
Um, oh yeah, Sonic 3D Blast, even though it wasn't that good. uh, oh, Fighters Megabix. There
Yep.
you go.
Yeah, Fighters
Yeah,
Mega
so
Mix, yes.
yeah, yeah, those were a few of the games I picked up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
and Resident Evil because I didn't have a PlayStation at the time. Um, I kind of held off on the PlayStation a little later, but that's another topic.
That is, yes. Um, because the Sega Saturn, for me, I first heard about it, because I remember I was reading a magazine, because at the time I was reading Game Informer in 1994, because I had a subscription back then. That was the only time I had a subscription. And Sega announced the Sega Saturn for Japan, and it released in November of that year. Because what I remember was just seeing that, and um, afterwards I didn't see it again afterwards. But the only game that I remember seeing on that was Virtua Fighter, and like I think they were hyping up Daytona USA, and I didn't really see anything Sega Saturn related until May, like no, actually June of 1995. This was after E3, but it was the last issue of the Game Informer that I got for my subscription because it was running out, and my parents were not going to, or at least my mom was not going to renew it at the time, and the entire E3 coverage, and they were mainly talking about the Sega Saturn. Like they had the games, they had Daytona USA, they had Panzer Dragoon, they had Virtual Fighter, they had Virtual Cop, they had a couple of other games as well. That were released around that time, and games that were going to be released like later in the year. Um, like I remember seeing Sega Saturn commercials throughout the entirety of '95, then all throughout '96 and '97. '97 was when it was time for us to get a new console because we were mostly focusing on Sega Genesis for a while, like, and a little bit of Super Nintendo, but it was mostly Sega Genesis. And what happened was, the Sega Saturn was on my mind because I was like, yeah, I want a Sega Saturn. And one of the main reasons why I wanted a Sega Saturn is because there was some arcade games that I was playing at the time. Mainly Daytona USA was one of them. Uh, Virtual Fighter 2, Virtual Cop. I played them a little bit in the arcade, but not as much as I did when I got the console. Um, and also, I got myself. Marvel Superheroes. That was the main game that I actually
Oh, that's a
wanted.
good one. Yeah.
That was the main game I wanted the Sega Saturn for.
Yeah, yeah.
Even though it was also coming out on PlayStation, I wanted Marvel Superheroes on Sega Saturn, and I remember getting it. Like my brother got my brother actually got it because it was a birthday gift. Even though we were both going to play it together because it's a two-player fighting game, but what I remember was I got a Sega Saturn for Christmas in December '97. Well, obviously Christmas Day '97. Um, I got that as well as three games that came with it: Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop, and Daytona USA. I got three of those games. And it also came with a demo disc called Bootleg Sampler that had um, a bunch of demos for games like Clockwork Knight and Sega Rally Championship, and trailers for upcoming games and
I
games
never
that
got around to playing Clockwork Knight. Did you play it? Was it good or?
my brother played Clockwork Knight. He enjoyed it. He loved it. I think that was the last game that we got for the Sega Saturn. But yeah. So I got one in Christmas Day '97, unaware of the fact that the Sega Saturn was not going to be around that much longer. So the thing about it is that Sega Saturn, like again, I don't regret getting a Sega Saturn, but at the time, I didn't know that it was going to do poorly, or it was doing poorly at the time. So, um, I just wanted it. I think what really made me want it is the fact, besides Marvel superheroes, I think what made me want it is the fact that, um, because I was heavily obsessed with Sonic the Hedgehog, and I had no idea about what happened with Sonic Extreme. I thought that it turned into Sonic 3D Blast, but it wasn't until later on that I found out what happened with Sonic Extreme. But I did get Sonic 3D Blast, Sonic Jam, and Sonic R. Like all three of those games. Um, because that's really all they have for Sonic on the Sega Saturn. They did not have like a true Sonic platformer on Sega Saturn at all throughout the entirety of the
It,
lifespan.
it's
Um,
kind of funny that Sonic Jam had that 3D mode. That was a really good 3D mode, but it was really short.
oh yeah, exactly. But but honestly, like it wasn't really disappointing at all. I mean, in terms of the fact that I had it, I had fun with it. But yeah, that's it. Um, so the next thing is, what are some of your fondest memories with the Sega Saturn? Because I have a couple. But you go
Oh,
first.
I have actually a ton. So I played the US games and I imported a few games as well. X-Men versus Street Fighter was one of the games I imported, and I got a 4 meg pack to get it, and it ran really good. So you know how Marvel vs. Capcom PlayStation only could play with one player,
Mm-hmm.
one character at a time. This one required a four meg cart and actually was arcade perfect. So
Yes.
that's why Sega Saturn was really good with that kind of thing. What was the question again?
Well, what your fondest memories about the Sega Saturn?
Fondness, yeah, yeah. So there are a few RPGs that came out in the U.S. There was Dragon Force, a good strategy RPG.
Mm-hmm.
This was before they like, oh no RPGs, whatever.
Yeah.
There was Shining, the Holy Ark, which I will continuing to say, if you ever get a chance to play that, please play it. It was made by the people of Golden Sun and
Yeah.
Shining in the Darkness and Shining uh,
Yeah.
Force.
Yeah. Shining Force. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, uh, Capcom fighting games have been Street Fighter Alpha, Darkstalkers, like you said, Marvel superheroes. Those
Mm-hmm.
were good days. Um, Fighting games in general, Fighting Vipers
Yeah.
was one of my favorites, alongside Virtual Fighter 2. But I like Fighting Vipers a lot more. But when I remember one time uh, Sega announced Fire's Megamix. I'm like, oh, this is really cool. But I couldn't get a whole, I couldn't actually buy it yet. And they had a copy in Blockbuster and I rented it. I'm like, oh, I need to get this game. This is a good game. Um, I also I forgot to mention in my launch title, Myst was one of them.
Yep.
I actually played and finished Myst before even getting a PC because I got a PC in '97.
Yeah.
Res Evil came out, and it wasn't better in terms of gameplay, but there was extra modes in it, and I enjoyed that. Um, Rayman, I think that was a rental. I thought it was kind of hard. Like I mentioned, Sonic Jam, uh, Sonic 3D Blast. The only good thing about it is the music.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I ever beat it outside the Genesis, which was recent. I unfortunately I did not like Sonic R very much. I know
Really?
you really liked it. And lastly, Tomb Raider. It came out before the PlayStation version, and I had to buy that game. Uh, Tomb Raider was really good. I did eventually get the PC version as well, but yeah, those are my fondest memories of it.
Yeah. Like for me, my fondest memories was like I remember like just the fact that when I got my Saturn back in Christmas Day in 1997, that was actually like I just could not stop playing it to the point where I just kept playing it all day, all night. Like I was 11 years old at the time, and it was not long after we moved to the apartment that I'm living in right now. Um, and what I remember was getting like we would get like at least one or two games a month. Usually like in terms of the games that I remember getting, and I remember going to a Funkoland with my parents and we ended up getting Sonic R. That was the first Sonic game that I got on the Saturn. I got the other two later, but getting Sonic R, um, and my brother and I would play it every day. My brother played it more than me though, but we both played it every day. There was like there was this Sega Saturn game that we got called Dark Savior, which is made by
Oh yeah,
the same developer as Landstalker.
yes.
And so basically, I played that before I even got a chance to play Landstalker. And and the thing about that game is the way it works is there are five different parallels, basically parallel universes. Though two of which are actually connected with each other, but the way it works is that in the first opening scene of the game, like you have to find like one of the main villains of the game, and if you depending on how fast you reach the captain's deck, where that villain is located, there's a good chance that you may actually change the course of the entire game. Like for like there's three in particular. Like if you happen to show up within a certain time limit, like because the timer is starts on blue. If it's red, like there's blue, yellow, and red. If it's red, it means that you got there very slowly to the point where like he escaped and then you fight somebody else in place. If it's yellow, you get there just in time and you get to fight him. And if it's blue, you get there in time. However, he escapes, but the difference is you're actually on the trail. You're not that far behind him. So at least you're on the trail to go and get him. And then there's some other storylines. You have to meet certain criterias, which let's just say it just depends on what you do. But other than that, the game is basically like an adventure. It's an action adventure game. I thought it was really good. Um, and
I have played that one actually. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
I still have the soundtrack in my mind.
Oh, I
And
should check that.
Yeah, it's really good.
revisit that soundtrack. Actually, yeah.
Basically, if you like Landstalker, you're gonna like this game. I would personally say, like I played a little bit of Landstalker, but I enjoyed Dark Savior more.
No, yeah, I got it.
Another game, my cousin got it for us, Guardian Heroes, where you could actually play it
Oh,
with like a total of 6 players. It was made by Treasure. It's a beat 'em up that has branching paths and there's 7 different endings in the game. Um,
wow.
it
Okay.
it was only ever re-released once on the Xbox 360, and it did have a sequel on the Game Boy Advance, Advanced Guardian Heroes, which we have, which I actually have it. And honestly, I feel like Guardian Heroes is a game that should have been re-released on all platforms. It should have been like, especially like modern platforms. It should have been on PlayStation 4 and 5, Switch, Xbox,
With
PC,
online play.
online play. Yes, that's a game that should have that would have been perfect to have on like both the Switch and the Steam Deck.
Oh
Like
yeah.
being able to play it with your friends. Like Guardian Heroes is the perfect game for that. But for Sega Saturn, that was actually a really good game to actually play with other people. And they have like an arena battle mode. It's like a fighting game, but with multiple characters throughout the whole game. It was a lot of fun. Um, and Another game that I got, I got Marvel Superheroes, but also Sega Saturn was my first foray into the Mega Man X series with Mega Man X4.
I was
Um,
just thinking about it. I wasn't sure if it was on Saturn, but yeah.
yes, yeah, because both Mega Man 8 and Mega Man X4 were on the Sega Saturn. I almost got Mega Man 8. I ended up getting something else instead, and to be honest, I wish I got Mega Man 8 instead. Um,
Mm,
yeah, and the thing is that with the Saturn version of Mega Man 8, like you get 2 secret boss fights that are not in the PlayStation version. You fight um Cutman and Woodman. And not only that, some of the music in the game is different compared to the PlayStation version. Like the Sega Saturn version in Japan came out first. The PlayStation version came out a little later. But
yeah.
in the United States, both versions released at the same time. Um, and I unfortunately didn't get 8 on Saturn. Um, though funny enough, I did get Mega Man 8 on PlayStation like last month when I was in Long Island Retro. So at least now I have an actual physical copy, even though I have multiple ways that I can play Mega Man 8 now. Um, and Mega Man X4 for that matter. Um, X4, like, there's no difference between Saturn and PlayStation in terms of content. Though I will say though, in terms of whether or not the Saturn version runs better than the PlayStation, like the load times are definitely like better on Saturn compared to PlayStation. But even then, it's the game is still it's still the same game regardless. Uh, but yeah, any Capcom fighting game on Sega Saturn ran better than it did on PlayStation. I agree with this. Though I never got myself a copy of X-Men versus Street Fighter with the 4 megabit cartridge. I,
I
w-
still have it.
I and the thing is, I would have put up with the whole Japanese text like that didn't matter to me. All that mattered was that I would have just done the versus mode, played it with my brother, my cousin when he would come over, and we would have fun. We would have done that. Um,
And
so
now you don't really have to worry about it because we got everything. But that's another story.
like I did rent a couple of games. I did rent Street Fighter Alpha 1. I wanted to rent Alpha 2, but they didn't have it at the Blockbuster that I went to, but they had Alpha 1, so I took that. Not knowing that Alpha 2 and Alpha 1, like Alpha 2 was basically like an updated version of Alpha 1 but better. Um
Yeah.
I mean, I had fun with Alpha 1, but I think I would have had a lot more fun with Alpha 2 at the time. If they would have had it at that Blockbuster, if I would have just waited and then got it on a different day. I did, however, get Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge. One of my uncles, it was either one of my uncles or my cousin gave that to us, and that game was fun. That game, the funny thing is that a year prior, I first played Vampire Savior in the arcade. That was my first Darkstalkers game I've ever played. But
Good start. Good start.
and
It's one
not
of the best.
and not long after that, my uncle had the first Darkstalkers game on PlayStation, so we played it a little bit there. But then it's like the first one I've owned was Night Warriors on Sega Saturn. That game was fun. Like basically, Night Warriors is the updated version of Darkstalkers, but adds two more characters, and you could play the bosses. You could play as the bosses. And the Saturn version had something unique where it actually has like the ability to let you change the intro to that of the first game, as well as like having the music from the first game in addition to the music from the second game, because the characters had slightly different themes or completely different themes altogether. But it was definitely worth it because Night Warriors did not release on PlayStation. Um,
They had Dark Souls 3, but yeah,
yeah,
that's besides the point.
yeah. And the funny thing is that Darkstalkers, um, the PlayStation version released after Night Warriors did because Capcom had trouble trying to port the game to PlayStation, so they ended up contracting Psygnosis to port the game to PlayStation because they had a much better time porting games to Sega Saturn than they did with PlayStation. So that's why like there were a lot of Saturn versions of Capcom's fighting games that tend to run better than on PlayStation. That's hence the fact that the versus games, yeah, you cannot play the versus games with the 2v2 tag mode unless there is a secret way on PlayStation where you can do it where one character is this guy, like let's say player one it chooses Ryu and player two chooses Cyclops, then both players would have Ryu and Cyclops but with different colors. Because there is a mode where you could do that, but you could not like have different characters all at once. But in Sega Saturn, as long as you have the 4 megabit cartridge, you could basically play the exact same game as the arcade, like with little to no compromises. So I'd say like the Sega Saturn version was definitely the best version. I would probably say up till now because now that we got the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection where you actually get the arcade perfect game. But that said, at the time, the Sega Saturn version was the best you were going to get if you want to have the true arcade experience for X-Men vs. Street Fighter. The same thing also applies with Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, which
We didn't get it over here though.
yeah, we didn't get over here either. We did get the PlayStation version, but again, same deal as X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Not as good on PlayStation as it is on Saturn. But Marvel vs. Capcom, that did not release on Saturn. That released on Dreamcast. So at least we did get that here. So at least there was an option. But back to fondest memories. So
Did you
go ahead.
play Nights into Dreams at the time?
Yes, I did.
Mm.
And beating the game with both characters. And the game was wonderful. It's
And what
one of
about Christmas Nights?
my cousin brought over Christmas Nights. But we did not own Christmas Nights, but my cousin brought it over, and it was nice to see it. It was absolutely like it was basically a special treat if you've already beaten Nights. It's,
Yeah.
it's basically DLC. So like I think I think it's in the Steam version as DLC. So at least Nights there's a platform you could play it on Steam. Though I would like for it to release on other platforms so more people can play it. There was this 2D platformer game that I played called Astal,
Oh,
which
I have that listed too.
that game had a great art style. Um, Unfortunately, you cannot save. You can only beat it in one sitting. You cannot save in the game. Yes,
Wow.
like I could not save for the life of me. Um, and unfortunately, I could never beat the game because the game was actually getting harder after a certain point. And when you're out, it continues. That's it. But unfortunately, I could not beat the game. I could not save in a stall. But that said, still a really good game. I would love to go back to that game someday and actually beat it, but Um,
You should.
yes. Another
What
game.
about
Go ahead.
what about Bug? Because I played a demo of that, and that was it. I didn't actually buy it or anything like that. I had
Oh,
fun with the demo though.
we did rent that one. We rented Bug. And I actually didn't really get to play it that much. My brother did, and he seemed to like it, but I didn't really get to play it much because we rented that on the same day that we rented Fighters Mega Mix, and
Oh, okay,
and
yeah,
my attention went to Fighters Mega Mix, which I enjoyed Virtual Fighter 2, and Fighters Mega Mix. That game was special. That game was wild because it took the entire cast of Virtual Fighter 2, the entire cast of Fighting Vipers, and they took characters from other Sega games that were developed by one of their studios known as AM2. It had Bark and Bean from Sonic the Fighters. It had the kid version of Akira and Sarah from Virtual Fighter Kids. Hell, if you want to know how wild this game is, it has the fucking Hornet race car from Daytona, USA. You could play as that. Um, that was fun. Like, honestly, I felt like, because that was one of the early times that I would see all these crossovers, like how, like, the first crossover game that I've seen was Battletoads Double Dragon, but the first crossover
yeah.
fighting game I've seen was Marvel versus, well, X-Men versus Street Fighter. But then when I play this, I'm like, this is great. This is wild. I loved every minute of it. Like, we loved it so much that we ended up buying the game later on, and we
Still
had.
have a copy.
I don't know if I still have it though, but I loved it. I enjoyed it. It was great. Also, other games. I never had a chance to play Fighting Vipers on Sega Saturn. Like, I think.
Oh, it was good. I think it was better than two, but that's an opinion.
Let's see. Other games that I remember playing. I played. There was this tennis game called Virtual Open Tennis, which I thought was pretty good. Um, there was there was this one. Um, there was this one game that you control a ship. I forgot what it was called. I'm gonna have to look it up. I just don't remember the name of it. And there was like this robot game called Robotica or something, and I didn't like it. It was not good. Um, but I
There's
remember,
also Virtual On.
yeah, I never got to play that one on the Saturn. I played the arcade.
Yeah,
I played the arcade version of Virtual On,
same
but I
here.
never got a chance to own Virtual On. Um, like, we got Sonic Jam, we got Sonic 3D Blast. I spent a lot of time on Sonic Jam playing all the Genesis games on Sega Saturn. Um, and also,
Die Hard Arcade was one.
yeah,
I played
I
I
never,
played the arcade and then I played the Sega Saturn. But yeah, go on.
I never got a chance to own Die Hard Arcade, but I did play the Saturn. I did play the arcade game, but I never had a chance to own the game on Saturn. I should have at least like rented it, but because in '98, Blockbuster still had Sega Saturn games that you could rent. They phased them out by 1999.
Yep.
But other games that we rented, we've rented, what else? That we rent.
House of the Dead.
No, I did.
Oh, I
They
don't think they had it actually.
No, like the Blockbuster I went to, I did not see House of the Dead there. I've only ever seen House of the Dead one of the arcades. I never had a chance to play the
Yeah,
Saturn.
same.
Though I heard the Saturn version was not as good as it was in the arcade. Like, it had half the frame rate as compared to the arcade game. Um, I never had a chance to play Burning Rangers, even though I wanted to.
Oh, that's one of that I
And
forgot about. Yeah.
and I never had a chance to play Shining Force 3. I believe Shining Force 3 was like the last Sega Saturn game that Sega released in North
Super
America.
rare. Oh, and Last Bronx was one of
Yeah.
the last games too.
Yeah. And the thing about Shining Force 3, um when they released it here, it was incomplete because in Japan there's three books, three parts of Shining Force 3. We only got one. Um and the other two were left in Japan. So
Mhm.
so they never finished the story. And at this point, um, I don't think we're ever going to see a re-release of Shining Force 3, which is a shame because people say that one's actually the best one.
Or release. Yeah, we got 1 and 2 here. Never mind. I was gonna say.
Yeah. Um, but also, what else did I play? So we got Clockwork Knight. We got there was a hang on game for Saturn because Sega made the hang on games. There was one for Saturn, like with all the bikes. Um, we got that. That was the last game we got. We actually got that after Clockwork Knight.
Hmm.
Um, Aside from that, we also had the Saturn version of Battle Arena Toshinden. We played that a lot back then. Um, even though I mostly associate Battle Arena Toshinden with PlayStation within the PlayStation's first year. Um, but also, what else did we get? Uh, I think
A
that
game.
I think that might have been
Oh,
it.
a game I wish I could have played was Legend of Oasis.
Yeah, that's a sequel to Beyond the Oasis.
Yes, yes.
Um, I remember there was one time I wanted Shinobi Legions, and then I decided against it and got a different game. And looking back, I made the right decision. Shinobi Legions does not look good.
Hmm.
Um, there was a Golden Axe duel game, and I never got that. Um, there was supposed to be an Eternal Champions game for the Sega Saturn, but
Yes.
but it got canceled because Sega of Japan wanted to focus more on Virtual Fighter, which ironically enough, they're not really focusing on Virtual Fighter right now. Um but yeah, I think there was supposed to be a Vector Man game that was planned for Saturn but never happened. I don't know for sure. But I actually wanted one and it didn't happen. Um also but yeah, um there were some other games I wanted to get. I remember I did get Earthworm Jim 2. The funny thing is that I was debating on either getting Earthworm Jim 2 or WWF in Your House. I went with Earthworm Jim 2, and to be honest, looking back, I actually made a better deal getting Earthworm Jim 2 than I did if I would have got WWF in Your House, because that game was, from what I've seen of it, it looked like a mediocre like arcade game that had wrestling. Um, Compared to Earthworm Jim 2, which I enjoyed, though not as much as Earthworm Jim 1. Um, but yeah, the sad thing about that is, regardless of which one I would have chose, I chose one of those games over the other over Mega Man 8.
Hmm.
I kind of wish I went with Mega Man 8 over Earthworm Jim 2, because to be honest, I actually like Mega Man 8 more as a game. Um, but yeah, uh, but yeah, for fondest memory is basically playing the games with with my brother or with my cousin whenever he would come over. But other than that, like that's pretty much it in regards to fondest memories. Um,
Yeah.
Next up is what are our favorite Sega Saturn games? We're gonna do up to five at the most, like no more than five for the sake of time. So what are your five favorite Saturn games, if you had to pick them?
Okay. Fighters Mega Mix.
Yep.
Very fun game. Let's see. Dragon Force. Strategy RPG. Uh, what was that one other? Oh, Shining the Holy Ark. Yes. Uh, there was one imported game that I got. KO
Hmm.
Flying Squadron 2.
Yeah.
Very fun platform shooter up. And oh, this is hard. How many did I choose? 3 or 4?
This would be number four.
4. Okay. It's hard to choose between like Tomb Raider and Resident Evil. Those are the other two that I would say good ones.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
Yep.
that'll be
So
my list.
all right. Well, for me, my list will go like this. So Number 5 for me is gonna be Fighters Mega Mix. Great game, loved it, and having the whole crossover appeal definitely worked. Having like all these characters from different games and you can use them to fight. The fact that they managed to actually fit all these characters in and still managed to actually give us a great roster filled with lots of stages and the fact that the gameplay just plays well, like, but it was more like fighting vipers where you had like there were no ring outs. Instead, you had like the cages, or like they would at least like put some sort of walls to prevent you from getting a ring out. So it played more like fighting vipers, but it was still good. It was still fun. That's number 5 for me. Number 4 for me is going to be Nights in the Dreams. That game was absolutely beautiful. For me, like I felt that it was probably one of the most beautiful looking games on the Sega Saturn, and I've enjoyed the gameplay. Though the only gripes that I have with it are the fact that it got pretty hard towards the end on both playthroughs. Like the kids, Clarice I believe is the girl and Elliot is the boy, and it got hard, but I still felt a lot more like one. There was a word that I was thinking of that in terms of how much well, in any case, I enjoyed the game. I enjoyed the game regardless. But honestly, number 3, this one I've actually had a lot more fun with. A lot more fun than I thought. And it actually was what got me into playing this game in the arcades more. Daytona USA. I love Daytona USA so much to the point where I could just go to the arcades and just play that whenever I want to. But playing on the Saturn back then, even though the frame rate wasn't the best, I still had fun. I still enjoyed Sega's Saturn version of Daytona USA. That's number 3. Um, Number 2 for me is going to be Marvel Superheroes because I spent so much time out of all the fighting games that I got on the Sega Saturn. That's the one that I spent the most time on. Marvel Superheroes, I love that game to death. And it got to the point where I actually started to be decent with Spider-Man. I was decent with
Nice, yeah.
a couple of other characters, but Spider-Man mostly. Um, and I just could not stop playing it. And number 1 for me is going to be Mega Man X4
Mhm.
because it's the game that got me into Mega Man X. While Mega Man 3 was the one that that got me to Mega Man, I Mega Man X4 was the one that got me into Mega Man X. And I loved that game. Like I ended up like getting I beat the game with both characters at the time a couple of times. Though I think I beat the game with Zero more than I beat the game with X back then. Though right now I could easily beat the game with X better than I could with Zero. Um, but
Never beat the last boss.
oh, the last boss was tough. It
Yeah.
it was challenging, but I managed to pull it off. Like as long as you know what the weaknesses are, you should be good to go. But Mega Man X, I'm gonna put that as number 1 for me because that one was special for me. It's like again, I enjoyed Mega Man 3, but Mega Man X4 wasn't. Not only did it just like got me into Mega Man X, it made me really want to play more Mega Man games. That was the game that really wanted me to play more Mega Man games. Um, though that I would later on in my life I would play more, but yeah. Um, so yeah, those are both of our favorite Sega Saturn games. So next up is going to be what do we think are some of the reasons that we think that the Sega Saturn failed outside of Japan? Because there's a lot to talk about here
Oh yeah.
in regards to the failure of the Sega Saturn in the West. So, what do you think, Soan?
Well, it started off when they announced it too quickly.
Yeah.
And KB Toys was one of the reasons, even though I didn't get it from KB Toys, but still, it didn't get enough all the uh, video games right off the bat, even though the launch titles were there. Toys R Us did not have them. And I'm like, why? Where's the games? What am I going to do?
Hmm.
That's why I didn't get it day one, besides the price point. That's another one. The price point was really expensive. Not as expensive as like 3DO, which was like, I don't know, I think it was $600 or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and at the time when they released the Saturn, they still had the 32X advertised. They had the Nomad. They had way too many peripherals at the time, so you didn't know what you were getting into. Should I buy this system because or not? What are you trying to advertise? Which one should I get?
Yep.
That it confused people, and then the whole I don't know when Bernie Stoller came in after I think Tom Kalinske came in. He was like no RPGs, and that really burned the U.S. because
Yeah.
there's a game Grandia. I don't think that came over here, but it was one of the
No.
exclusives in Japan. I'm glad we finally got it. And
Yeah.
then there was
Well,
all these canceled. Sonic Extreme was hyped up and then canceled right off the bat. And then Sony just swooped in and said, "Nope." And that's it. That's pretty much it.
yeah, because so one thing I want to say is that regarding Grandia, um, we did, however, get Grandia on PS1 here. It was not,
Yeah.
yeah, it was not released in Sega Saturn in North outside of Japan. Um, and there were plenty of games that were slated to come out for Sega Saturn, but didn't because of the no RPG rule, and also there was the no 2D rule, which
Oh,
aside from one Sega Ages, like Sega released multiple like classic arcade and Genesis games, and I think Master System as well onto Sega Saturn. I think there might have been a Fantasy Star collection that was only released in Japan.
I
Um,
remember. Yeah.
and all those games, like those collections and compilations, didn't release here. And there were also some like compilations based off of Capcom's games, like the arcade games, and those did not release here. Then again, a lot of them did not release on PlayStation except for the Street Fighter Collection 2. The Street Fighter Collection 1 released on both, but Street Fighter Collection 2 only released on
Yeah.
PlayStation in North America. Um, but I also know that in terms of the reasons why I felt that the Sega Saturn failed outside of Japan, there's going to be a lot for me to talk about here because yes, I too recall like all those advertisements for the Nomad and the 32X. Not to mention the fact that Sega was still reeling from the Sega CD, which wasn't really performing that well, but the 32X ended up selling way worse and it got discontinued very quickly. Because I remember there was so much hype in the beginning, like all these commercials for the 32X. And then a few
Hmm.
months later, I would see them in bargain bins at Toys R Us.
Yep.
And the same thing with Nomad. Nobody was buying these. Nobody was buying them. They were in the bargain bins. Only a select few people got them. Like I did not really see that many people I know that had Nomads. Only one person maybe, and even then, what I also remember was the Sega Saturn, like seeing all these advertisements. Like I remember the commercials. Here's one that really. There's two that stood out. Actually, never mind. Three that stood out to me the most, all of which were attacking other consoles. There was one that was a general attack in the PlayStation console. They calling it the Plaything, and
Oh yeah.
they would show like all the different Sega Saturn games, and that Sega had a legacy of making games for the arcades, and Sony had no such legacy, which that's true, but then they talk about like how PlayStation had one processor whilst Sega Saturn had a lot more. Um, and not only that, but they depicted the PlayStation as this. There was this baby in a crib that had the PlayStation like mat, like the PlayStation mask, like all over, with the exception of the face. Um, and the baby was looking like to be crying and all that stuff. That's the first commercial that I remembered. Another one was the Knights commercial where they advertised Knights for Saturn, and halfway into the commercial, it turned from an advertisement of Knights to Sega basically talking shit about the PlayStation, and someone was holding onto a PlayStation. They must have been in some sort of on top of a skyscraper, and then they just let the PlayStation go, and the announcer was like,
I
"Fly,
yeah, I remember
fly, plaything, fly. You're not ready." It was just like falling down. Um, and then the third commercial that I remember specifically, this time they were going after the Nintendo 64 and called
yeah.
it,
This is one I remember too. Yeah,
and they called it the Pretendo. Like they were just showing off random Sega Saturn games, and then towards the end of the commercial, um, they ended up sending the Nintendo 64 to the sky, and someone shot it, and then it exploded.
yeah. It made me think of like Duck Hunt or something, like they were
Yeah,
trying to parody it or something.
it's kind of like clay shooting. Like
Yeah, yeah.
to practice your shots. But yeah, those commercials I remember seeing, as well as commercials that were specific towards different Sega Saturn games. Like I've seen one for Sonic 3D Blast. I've seen one for like all these different games in general. That being said, like I was seeing less and less of these commercials over time, like a lot less. By '97, and advertisements were starting to like slow down. I was seeing more advertisements for PlayStation and N64 games, and even Game Boy. Hell, I was even seeing advertisements for the Gamecom back then. Remember the
Oh
Gamecom?
yes, yes, yes.
And the funny
It's
thing
that
is,
one
go ahead.
party thing on the stage. I think it was with the guy talking about the game card and how amazing it was.
Yeah, like because I remember and the Gamecom's failure kind of goes hand in hand with the Sega Saturn in a way. Cause and the reason why I bring that up is because there were Sega Saturn games that were ported to the Gamecom. Like Sonic Jam was one of those games.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
really bad version too.
it's bad. Like they're all bad. But I just find that funny. Like so Gamecom mentioned in 2024. But yeah. But what I remember also seeing is like looking at the Japanese box arts for Sega Saturn games, and you compare them to the North American box arts. What I remember is how different they were, because the Sega Saturn, like they had like a silver box art over here, and in Japan it was gold with a completely different logo.
Yep.
For Europe it was black, but with the same Sega Saturn logo that we had over here. And Europe lasted just a tiny bit longer compared to North America. Like it just died like really fast by 1998, and
Our boxes were bigger too
they were
compared to the Japanese ones, where you could like it was a CD case and you could just hide it anywhere. Where are you gonna put this giant case?
yeah, yeah, because PlayStation started with something like that, and then they switched to the small CDs later
Oh
on.
yeah,
Like
that too. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, sometime in '96, PlayStation made the switch to the smaller jewel cases that um people recognize more. Um, and they did not break anywhere near easily compared to the Sega Saturn ones. Because Sega Saturn, they used the same ones as Sega CD.
yeah.
Um, and the main thing about it is that in terms of other reasons why the Sega Saturn actually failed outside of Japan, so the no RPG rule, they later implemented the no 2D rule once Bernie Stolar came in, because Tom Kalinske left sometime in '96. Because here's the thing, and this is something I want to bring up. I feel like this is the perfect time for me to bring up. So there were two instances where Sega almost had a completely different console, but Sega of Japan was like, no, we are 100% dead set on the Sega Saturn. And mind you, this is before the 32X was even a thing. Um, so um, after the whole fallout of the Nintendo and Sony deal, where Sony pretty much wanted like to have the rights to Nintendo's IPs on the Super Nintendo CD, but Nintendo ended up having to um partner up with Philips, stabbing Sony in the back in the process.
Hmm.
Sony went to Sega. We were like, hey, we don't like Nintendo, and I'm pretty sure you guys don't like them either. So let's team up. Let's make a console together. And what we're going to do is we're gonna make the hardware. You guys make the software, and any profits that we gain or lose, we will split it 50-50, and together we will be the driving force of the gaming industry. Sega of America was 100% on board with this. They wanted to do it. Tom Kalinske loved this idea. He was willing to do it. But when he reported it to Sega of Japan, they rejected it. And they were like, how dare Sony try to get in? They have no business being in this industry.
And we would have had a combo of Sony and Sega. Oh man.
So that console became when Sega basically Sega Japan turned Sony down. Sony went solo, and the PlayStation would be the very first home console to sell over 1 million units, and it beat both the N64 and PlayStation in that gen. And then there was another story that I want to bring up. So there was this company that made like a lot of really good CGI using specific computers known as Silicon Graphics computers. So Silicon Graphics, they went to Sega in hopes to make a deal with making a new video game console using their Silicon Graphics 3D CGI technology, and they pitched the idea to Sega. Sega of America was impressed. Tom Kalinske was absolutely over the moon with it, to the point where he felt that that's the future. That's what's going to revolutionize gaming, like 3D graphics in that particular style. So after Silicon Graphics pitched it to Sega of America, they would go. Tom Kalinske would go to Japan and pitch all of that to Sega of Japan, and Sega of Japan once again says no, that they were dead set on the Sega Saturn. Sega Saturn was the console that they were going to work on, and they did not want to scrap the idea of the Sega Saturn and then go with whatever it is that Silicon Graphics was pitching. So where does Silicon Graphics go next? They go to Nintendo and pitch the idea, which ended up becoming the Nintendo 64. So not only did Sega ended up passing up on the PlayStation, but they also passed up on the Nintendo 64. So so that's two consoles that they passed up in favor of the Sega Saturn. But right after Sega of Japan passed up both of them, that's when the 32X came out. And the 32X, it barely lasted a year. Even though there were some games that they released in 96, I think they were just sent to die.
I think it was months, not even a year.
Yeah. Like the prime example of a 32X game being sent to die was Spider-Man Web of Fire. That game, I felt like they just released it, didn't even care, and the game was not even good. So there's that. But
on the topic of, because we're talking about the failings of the U.S., but in Japan it did really well.
It did.
But the main reason for it, besides RPGs, was their marketing. What was it? Sega Taro or whatever?
Segata.
I forgot his name. Segata, yeah.
Yeah, Segata Sanshiro, yes.
The marketing was genius over that. We probably, if we got him as a commercial thing, we would probably have a Sega Saturn longer than we really did.
Yes. Which I'm gonna answer the community questions on that later on. But the Japanese marketing was spot on. It was excellent the way they did it. Having Sagata Sanshiro basically saying you must play the Sega Saturn in
Yeah.
Japanese, because that's what it is. It worked, but the thing is, looking at the lifetime sales in Japan, it barely beats the N64, but it did better. I believe it did better than the Mega Drive in Japan. The Mega Drive did not do
Yeah.
well in Japan. Because when you look at the fourth generation, the Super Famicom was number one over there. Number two was actually the PC Engine or the Turbo Graphics 16. But the Mega Drive was a distant third. But for this generation, like the Sega Saturn barely beat the N64, just like how the Xbox barely beat the GameCube in lifetime sales, but both of them still lost to the PlayStation 2. But for this generation, like PlayStation, like it was a force to be reckoned with. Like you were able to play CDs, which the Sega Saturn could also do, but it had like a huge third party support, and the whole no RPG thing bit Bernie Stoller and Sega, like it basically blew up in their face, all for one reason. Sony had Final Fantasy VII, and
Yeah.
that ended up being what made RPGs more mainstream in the West, because they kind of had a cult following before that. Like they would sell well, but they were not like heavy hitters in terms of sales until Final Fantasy VII released. And then after that, like I believe the last overall Sega Saturn game, even though the last one from Sega themselves in North America was Shining Force 3, the last one overall was a third party game that released over here called Magic Knight Rayearth.
I remember that one.
But in Japan, the last game to release on the Sega Saturn over there is Final Fight Revenge. Yes, that was the last Sega Saturn game to release in Japan in the year 2000, while
Hmm.
the Dreamcast was still out. But that said, there's a couple of other factors in terms of why the Sega Saturn failed. Um, no 2D, no true Sonic game on the platform. We were good. Like Sonic Extreme was in the works, but that got canceled because they kept trying to make the game. They had different ideas. One of those ideas that they had was they wanted to use the Knights engine, and they were developing it. They and they were and a lot of people within Sega loved it, except Yuji Naka. Yuji Naka
Hmm.
got so angry that he threatened to quit Sega if they released Sonic Extreme on that engine. Though though obviously it's not the first time Yuji Naka screwed people over in Sega or in general, um, but he's another topic for a different day. But I
Yeah,
brought
pretty
him up
much.
because it's relevant to the story. So then,
Yeah.
like, they kept trying to develop the game. It was to release it in the holiday season '96, and they didn't really make that much progress. Some people got sick. Some people quit. Sega Technical Institute. When the game was canceled, Sega Technical Institute shut down. Um, and a lot of the people who were working there moved on to other companies. Like one of the biggest examples I can think of is Mark Cerny, who would go to Sony after this. Um, and another factor is that not having a new Sonic, like like a true new Sonic game really hurt. All it got was 3D Blast, which was just basically the Genesis game but with better graphics and a different soundtrack, which the soundtrack is fantastic and a completely different special stage. But
Yeah.
it wasn't really the Sonic game that people wanted, like especially considering the fact that the Nintendo 64 that year, the first game that you get with the 64 was Super Mario 64. and that actually revolutionized um 3D platformers at the time. Plus, the PlayStation also got Crash Bandicoots,
Oh yeah.
and that series would go on to become very popular as well. Um, and unfortunately, Sega couldn't really come up with anything regarding Sonic other than that. Um, but Sonic Extreme getting canceled was definitely a huge blow. Um, and another factor that I want to bring up, because yes, the marketing was not good. The marketing was actually terrible. Like, because they were relying on heavy, edgy marketing. Plus, at that time, openly talking crap about like other companies was starting to get old. Um, Granted, Sony kind of did it by having Crash Bandicoot right in front of the Nintendo of America's offices back then. As
But that
well.
was lighthearted, I believe. It was
Not
just like
yeah, it
it
was.
wasn't mean spirited or anything like that.
And and the only other thing that generation was like Nintendo. In a Star Fox Nintendo Power ad, they had a guy that represented Sony and a guy that represented
Oh
Sega.
yeah, I remember that. Yes.
That but that one was supposed to be like a parody. Well, not really a parody. It was supposed to be like they were committing to some sort of bit, which in the end wasn't really that great. But I still like it better than what Sega did. Like what Sega was trying to do. Like they were just taking actual shots. The others, they were just basically just having fun with it, whatever it is they were doing. This was just like ridiculous. And um, unfortunately, it did not work. And um, I remember, and also Bernie Stoller like is one of the main reasons why the Sega Saturn did not do that well in the United States. He made a lot of really bad decisions regarding the Sega Saturn. Like I feel like he pretty much just gave up on that really quickly once he came in.
Oh, he said that when the Dreamcast was in development, he really wanted it out the door already, and Japan's like, "Wait, slow down. We."
Yeah, like I remember like he made statements at different E3s. Like for example, he said Saturn is not our future,
Yeah.
which he said that back in 1998, and at the time, a lot of people just didn't really know what to make of it, other than the fact that Sega was just waving the white flag, giving up on the Sega Saturn in North America at the time. So we went from like a good year and a half of not having any Sega products on the market until September 9th, 1999, when the Sega Dreamcast released. And the funny thing is, the day before the Sega Dreamcast release, Bernie Stoller was fired.
Oh, I don't remember that part.
He actually was fired the day before the Sega Dreamcast release.
Makes
Um,
sense.
and afterwards, he has since passed away, but
I think he went to Xbox for a while.
that was Peter Moore. That was a
Oh,
different
my
person.
bad. You're right. I'm getting the two confused.
Yeah. Peter Moore was Bernie Stoller's replacement. Then he went to Xbox, he went to EA. Now like I don't even know whatever happened to him. Or but in any case, so those are the main reasons why the Sega Saturn did not do well outside of Japan. But if I could think of one more reason, well, it's just the fact that the way that they handle everything, like it was doomed from the start. The moment that they released the console way too early, like it was supposed to release in September of 1995, and it was supposed to release either a week or 2 weeks after the Sony PlayStation. But um, it's just that Sega of America actually didn't want to release it like when they did. They were forced to do it by Japan.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that, and not funny as in a laughing matter, but more in an ironic sense, Sega of Japan pretty much fucked a lot of things over and refused to take responsibility. They blamed like the American branch, And to this very day, Sega of Japan and Sega of America are still not in the best of terms. And the middleman is Sega Europe, because both of them respect Sega Europe. That's sad. That is
Well,
very sad.
from what I heard, though, Japan did step in after the Saturn was failing, but it was much too late to do anything about it because they didn't understand the culture of the U.S. and how we handled things, and so that's another. I think they were trying to figure out what's going on in that season.
Yeah. And the other thing also is that when Sega Saturn practically failed, um, it just left a huge void for Sega. Like, because all you had was Nintendo and PlayStation. That's it
Mm-hmm.
until the Dreamcast release. And honestly, it's just sad how Sega has some good ideas, but when management meddles, then it gets to a point where the consumers lose in the end. And
Yeah.
and yeah, so those are the reasons that we think that the Sega Saturn failed outside Japan. So now the next thing is how much before we do the community questions. So I want to know how much has the Sega Saturn meant to the both of us? You first, Sound.
Um, I mean, I still have it. I enjoyed a lot of the games, and I did try to get a lot of the games that couldn't, the rare ones, but they were very hard to get.
Mm-hmm.
I bought all the RPGs, despite the fact that Dragon Force was really hard to get, by the way, but I did get it. It was rare, and I wanted to get Shining Force 3, didn't get a chance because it was like they made like 30,000 copies, not even, like very small. And that pissed me off. But the first year, the first 2 years were really good. They were very fun, and I, I'm just a Sega fan, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest. And Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, Sega Genesis, they still live in my heart, despite the fact that I know what the truth is,
Mm-hmm.
and the Civil War and stuff like that. That between them, which is sad, but yeah, that's what it means to me.
Yep. For me, Sega Saturn meant a lot to me, like because it was what helped me open up on what type of games I was interested in. And this was also during the time in which I was getting into fighting games a lot more. And the majority of the fighting games that I was getting into um, were mostly from Capcom. And I was getting into these games, and having Sega Saturn let me play some of these games, not all of them, but some of them, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Mainly, the main two games that I enjoyed were Marvel Superheroes and the Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge. Those two,
Mm-hmm.
although I did play some Alpha 1, but again, I wish I got to rent Alpha 2 at the time. There was an Alpha 3 Saturn version, but it was only in Japan. Um, I did get that game on PlayStation, but yeah. Um, but having these games, trying out different genres for the first time, or experiencing something that I would like even more later on in my life than when I would before playing them, it was surreal. Like seeing 3D fighters like Virtua Fighter, Fighting Vipers, or Fighters Mega Mix. Never really had a chance to play Last Bronx. Um, but
Me neither.
yeah, because that came very late. But the Sega Saturn meant a lot to me because it actually opened up my eyes to trying different games that I otherwise probably wouldn't really try, or if I would, I'm not sure if I would have liked them. But I still had a lot of memories. Again, I may not have had the foresight of knowing that the Sega Saturn was actually like not doing well, and it was gonna be and Sega was gonna stop the support of the console. And I would have got a different console instead of Saturn, I would have got either PlayStation or N64. But despite that, I have no regrets because I still had a great time playing Sega Saturn games, whether if I bought them or rented them. I had a great time regardless.
Yeah.
So that's how much it means to me. But now we are gonna go on to the community questions, and I want to say first because Dragon asked in this chat, would you guys want a Sega Neptune these days? No, 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 I don't think so.
I think they released that recently. I don't in a different. Uh,
That was like a
but
fan. It was a fan made console. It was like
yeah,
because
yeah.
it was based on a console that was supposed to come out, which was basically just a 32X but standalone, and it got
Then no.
canceled.
Then definitely no.
Yeah. Um, but Dragon actually asked, if Sega Saturn was added to NSO, what would be your top three games to launch with it? So if Sega Saturn was on the Nintendo Switch Online, more likely on the expansion pass because Nintendo would have to pay Sega to get the games on there. So, top three games to launch with them. Well, Fighters Mega Mix would be one of those games. Um, Sonic R and Guardian Heroes. And the reason I chose these games is because they're all multiplayer based. Although, actually, let me actually throw one more in that I just realized just now. Saturn Bomberman. Saturn
Oh,
Bomberman. Now that is a game that I feel that because I think it can go up to 8 to 10 players, but the fact that you can actually do that on Sega Saturn back then because you need to buy a separate multi-tap because the Saturn only had two controllers on the port. But if you got a multi-tab, you could actually go up to I believe 8 players, maybe 10, um, for some cases. So and the thing is that with the multi-tab, you'll be able to play Sonic R 4 players. So I mainly picked these games because of the focus of the multiplayer. Though I feel like for certain games they would not make it in, like the Darkstalkers games or like Street Fighter or Marvel because of the collections that we have now. But I do think whatever was not is not in any collection in any way would most likely be on the NSO. What do you think, Soan?
well, I would do it in categories. We would have to have one RPG,
Mm-hmm.
one action game, and one fighting game. The fighting game would be Fighters Megamix.
Yes.
The action game would be Die Hard Arcade,
Mm-hmm.
and RPG would be Shining the Holy Ark. Those are the three ones I would start with.
Yeah. Like I would also throw in a couple of games like some deep cuts like Mr. Bones. I would
Oh yeah,
I would throw
yeah.
that in both bugs, a stall,
Oh yeah,
both
Bug's
clockwork
good. Yeah,
both Clockwork Knights. If you wanted another good racing game that's not Daytona USA, um, I would honestly recommend Sega Rally Championship. That one's fun.
I was questioning when you said Daytona because you mentioned Sega Rally before. You said Daytona a while back, so
Like I play Daytona more, but I like the
uh,
music a lot from Sega Rally.
gotcha, gotcha.
Um, but there's plenty of Sega Saturn games that should be re-released. There was like
Yeah.
there was this one game called 330 Dwarves, which
Oh yeah, yeah. I never got around to playing that one.
like that's a beat 'em up. Uh, but yeah, like otherwise, some games that appeared on Saturn also appeared on PlayStation, like Tomb Raider, Resident Evil. But the thing, and also there was supposed to be a Streets of Rage 4 for Sega Saturn, but it got canceled because apparently, um, I believe it was Bernie Stoller who said he'd never heard of Streets of Rage.
Oh my god.
Oh no, no, that's actually that was a different producer, and that was for a Dreamcast pitch that didn't come out.
Oh
But
yeah, yeah,
there was
yeah.
a there was one. It was developed by Core Designs, and Sega did not like what they seen, so they rejected the pitch, and then Core Designs brought that game to Eidos, and then they made Fighting Force out of that. So the first Fighting Force for PlayStation was actually supposed to be Streets of Rage 4 for Saturn.
Yeah.
Um, and then they made Fighting Force, because Fighting Force, I think they did plan to release the game on the Saturn, but it got canceled. They did, however, release it on the Nintendo 64 as Fighting Force 64. Um, and it was okay. I didn't finish it, but it was okay. That's all I'll say about it. Um, Next question is from Ice Pick. Do you think the Saturn could have been salvaged in the West? And this is one topic I definitely want to talk about. Um, the only way that Sega Saturn would have been salvaged in the West is if they would have released the console on time back in September 95. If they would have released it then at a decent price point, like not $4.99, if they would have went with not $3.99, but if they would have went with $2.99, which was the price, though, if they would have just not set the price till after like PlayStation set their price, then they would have at least had a decent price point to compete with what PlayStation was going for at the time. Have a much bigger launch lineup with both first and third party support. I think that would have been fine. Aside from that, I'm thinking that like if they would have at least managed to not mess anything up regarding the Sega Saturn's launch and had better marketing than what they had, then yes, I think that
I
this
would I
I
would add to the Sonic lineup, at least release Sonic Extreme. It probably wouldn't have been amazing or anything, but at least we had a Sonic game to work with.
I'm gonna go the extra mile and say that there should have been like two Sonic games within the first year. I would have actually have done like two games from two different teams. What
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would have done a 2D Sonic game that would have felt like a swan song to 2D Sonic at the time. It would have been Sonic 4, but it would have taken place after Sonic 3 and Knuckles. It basically would have been Sonic 3 and Knuckles um on steroids. That's what it would have been. And then the 3D Sonic would have been extreme.
Yeah.
That's what I would have done. Um and if they would have had all that, then they would have at least been salvaged in the West. Even if it didn't, even if it ended up not beating PlayStation, even if it ended up not being PlayStation at all, um, it still would have done well. It would have done a lot better in terms of sales, and it would have lasted longer. That's how I felt. That's how I feel about it. What would you say? How would you have salvaged the Sega Saturn in the West if it
I'm
would have
gonna
been?
pretty much mimic you. You pretty much covered all the bases. The release date should have been September. The advertisement should have been better. The price point should have been better. Uh, Let the RPGs go. uh, yeah, just that.
Yeah,
I don't got anything else to say about that. Those are pretty much marketing, yeah, but yes.
yeah. So next one's from Dari. What would Sega's future have been had the Saturn been a success? Um, if the Saturn would have been a success, they would have just kept on building up on that success by making a console. They probably would have made a console. I don't know if they would have made a console like the Dreamcast, but they probably would
I
have made a.
wouldn't know.
But they probably would have used the console. Made a console based off of a different arcade board that they made called Model 3, which the
Oh
main
yeah, I remember.
the main games that I remember that used that were Virtua Fighter 3, and there was a light gun game called LA Machine Guns that used it. Um and there were a couple other games. I think there was a Daytona game that ran on that engine too. So if they would have ran on that, I think that's what they would have based it off of. But it was actually a very expensive board. So whereas the Naomi board was actually um less expensive in comparison. But basically, they just would have kept on going making games. So that's how I felt. They just would have kept on going. What about you, Sam?
What was the question again?
What what would Sega's future have been had the Saturn have been a success?
Yeah, we wouldn't have a Dreamcast, and we wouldn't have a Naomi board. We would probably get a Naomi board, but it wouldn't be based on the Sega Saturn. Um, a lot of they would probably have focused more on the 2D aspect as well,
Mm-hmm.
because it was a 2D powerhouse. That was the main focus. Um, if Bernie Stoller was fired before then, uh, they would probably have made a lot of, even Castlevania, which did come out in Japan, would have been probably developed better, because the Sega Saturn was very hard to program. That was another fault I forgot to mention.
Yeah, the Sega Saturn
It was,
was really hard to program. Yes.
yeah, that's why you didn't get a lot of games on the Sony front. It was easier to program.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, this it would have been probably much better.
Yep. And the last question comes from Epic Man. What is the best Sega Saturn game to you? Again, Mega Man X for me. Out of the ones I played, Mega Man X.
Oh god, this is a hard one.
Oh, Mega Man X4. Sorry, Mega Man X4.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Shining the Whole Eric.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still got. I would love to play these games someday, but the thing is, collecting Sega Saturn games is very expensive. If you think that collecting games from like Nintendo, PlayStation, or Xbox are expensive,
Yeah.
try collecting Sega Saturn. Panzer Dragoon Saga is one of the most expensive games to get now.
Yeah.
That's a game I've been wanting to play for years, and that one's expensive. And
I was trying to get it this whole time, and even back then it was like, oh, eBay, it's $200, $300. I'm like, I don't have that kind of money. I'm sorry.
even back in even back in the early 2000s, it was still pretty expensive.
Yeah.
So it was always expensive. It's just that now it's even worse.
Yep.
So yeah, and as Dragon says in chat, you could say they have out of this world pricing. that they do. But yeah, like that's gonna do it in regards to the Sega Saturn. This is a console that should have been successful but wasn't. But that's because of a multitude of factors we've already discussed. And honestly, I feel like Sega Saturn could have been at least a decent hit here if they wouldn't have, if at least Sega Japan did not make all the mistakes they did, or the way that Bernie Stoller handled things. It could have been better, but overall, I think that it was still a fun console with great games, that many of which are lost to time and need to be re-released. The sad thing about that is these games have to be rebuilt from the ground up, because Sega does not have the source codes to any of these. They have to rebuild the games from the ground up. And it takes time to do it too. So that's it. But yeah, Soan, thank you for joining in for sharing with Shellshock. I appreciate you coming through as always. Before we go, where can we find you?
My username for Twitch is Soan with a 0.
Mm-hmm.
You can link that. I'm currently playing Ocarina of Time on Monday with a bunch of people. It's a randomizer co-op. We're getting some progress, I believe. And Friday, because I had to switch to Monday, is going back to the Sega Genesis classics. I'm going to finish that up. So you can reach me at Twitter as Son Subishi. You'd have to type that out.
Yep.
And then Blue Sky is just Soan, Soan. That's it.
and that's Twitch. Sorry, but Twitter. Anyway,
Yeah.
but anyway, you guys can find me at on pretty much anywhere on like social media, Shellshock Prime. You can find me pretty much anywhere. But in regards to Twitch, I mostly do daily streams Monday through Thursday from 7 or 8 p.m. Eastern until about midnight Eastern time. With the occasional Sundays and the very rare Friday, like today being a Friday stream, like the very rare Friday. Um, but that said, the next episode of Sharing with Shellshock should be happening on Sunday, November 22nd, and that will be all about Mario Kart. So that's going to be a fun topic. We're going to be talking all about Mario Kart. So that will be fun, and I'm looking forward to that. That's going to do it. Again, Soan, thank you so much for being a part of this. I really appreciate you.
Appreciate the invite.
And I appreciate you having you on as well. And as always, make sure to take care of yourselves, be awesome, stay awesome, tell your loved ones you love them, check up on them as always. Fight for your lasting peace, and I'll see you guys next time. And I'll see you for the next I'll see everybody for the next episode. So take care, everybody. Good night.